about tariffs because tariffs are the most common, most visible form of protectionist policy. So knowing how they work, what they look like, the implications of them is a really important skill, in my opinion. All right. So just having a wee look at it. All right, the yellow box, that was our tariff revenue, right, that the government was able to earn. It's a tax, so the government can earn tax revenue. So you might make an argument that a tariff is a good thing for a government because they're able to earning the revenue. We also saw in our diagram how we had deadweight loss, okay, which meant that societal welfare was not being met, right, the way we wanted it to be met. It was not allocatively efficient. We also understand that this will lead to potential misallocation of resources. It's going to lead to more, quite probably, unemployment. It might lead to higher prices for the goods. It might lead to less choice. It could lead to all sorts of weirdnesses with regards to income distribution, but also resource distribution as well. And that is around the world because it's international trade. So tariffs being a very visible protectionist policy tend to be the ones that get targeted by organizations like the World Trade Organization, okay, the World Trade Court, the World Trade Organization, and also the trade deals that you see. When countries do these humongous big trade deals, quite often the trade deal is all about tariffs. There are a few other aspects of protectionist policies that we're also going to look at, and yes, they can also appear in the free trade deals as well, and we're going to unpack some of those free trade deals and see what they all mean as well. Right, so that's still to come. But this diagram, knowing all the different parts of it, is a very useful diagram for you to have. So please, if you're not sure as to how to draw this, some practice will help. Also, if you need, ask questions. Yep. All right. Because we can also imagine subsidies. Now, subsidies are harder to see because they are a payment made by the government to the producers. So it's not quite as obvious that they are there. They are technically classified as a protectionist policy, particularly, obviously, if you're talking international trade-wise. All right. Now, what they are going to do is they're going to create an unfair trading environment by decreasing the costs of production for whatever the product is. And then how are they going to be able to compete, the other firms? Yeah. Now, anyone got a guess as to which country has some of the biggest subsidies of any country in the world? Which country might that be? Comes up in the news quite a bit. Not necessarily the subsidies, but have a guess. Which country has an awful lot of subsidies? Yes, indeed. Well, you say us. I'm not sure if you're meaning us or if you're meaning US. Who might you be meaning, Winhow? Yes, the USA, absolutely right. America is one of the most subsidized nations in the world, scarily enough. And you don't have to have watched their politics long to see how that works, where the business organizations lobby the government to help them, okay, by providing subsidies or favorable laws or whatever. Okay, there's a lot of that goes on. Right? They call it basically a buffet, okay, which means that businesses are able to go to Washington and kind of just pick, food, as much food as they want, because the politicians will just throw money at them, sort of idea. And you're thinking I'm crazy. I know, well, you think that normally. But if you do investigate subsidies, and in the future you might, okay, you might become a trade economist working for the WTC. I don't know. If you do investigate them, you will find that there are some farmers, in particular grain farmers, in America who are actually subsidized to over 100% the cost of their crop. Now, what that means is the US government was wanting them to not produce grain because they're wanting the price to be higher. So they're actually paying them not to produce. And so the farmers take that subsidy and then they produce something else on their land and sell that as well. Okay? So they're being paid to not produce. That's how crazy some of these subsidies can get. Right? One other really substantial industry that gets subsidized quite heavily, believe it or not, is the sugar industry. Shh, tell anyone. All right? Because sugar is in absolutely everything, there are some big subsidies that come with the sugar industry. Right? Then if you consider other countries, other parts of the world, the European Union and the agricultural subsidies that they employ. Now, if you haven't seen Europe, you might not be aware that some of their farms aren't particularly efficient. Anybody been and seen some of the farms in Europe? Yeah? They aren't what you would call efficient. Right? If you were to compare the farms in Europe with the farms, say, in New Zealand or Australia even, a huge difference in efficiency. The only farms that I can see that would be less efficient, more or less, would be the Japanese farms. In Japan, they have sometimes vertical farms because they don't have the land. So they have multi-story farms, which is quite a weird sort of situation. But in New Zealand, because we just got the space, we just have thousands and thousands of sheep. And therefore it becomes productive, okay, to have that many head of livestock, so to speak. But in Europe, you know, a French farmer might have, you know, 3 cows or 5 sheep, and then therefore need a subsidy from the government in order to keep their farm going. It's not quite that sort of extreme, but it is close. And they can get, people who get given subsidies, the problem with subsidies is once you give it to a business, once you give it to a farm, once you give it to whoever, they want that money. They want to keep it. And if you decide that you want to stop paying them that money, they might be a little upset. And in France, there have been protests about possibly removing or decreasing subsidies. They blocked major roads in France with their big combine harvesters. They used what are called muck. And they sprayed their parliament in France with, muck, okay, as a form of protest when they dared suggest removing subsidies. So now what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to illustrate what a subsidy looks like as it applies to international trade. So it's going to look very much like it did in our microeconomic analysis, but in this case, we're going to have a trade price, a world price. So therefore, it's potentially, okay, going to be a bit different. Now, you don't worry. No, I'll go backwards. Because what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up a Jamboard. And we can do it together just to start. All right, so if I open up this Jamboard here, Sariha here today? I haven't seen her. Let's see her. All right, let's open up the Jamboard. I should be able to change it. Doesn't matter. All right, so what I'm going to do, team, is I will present it. And then we'll do this. Hopefully this will make sense. All right, so more or less you've got the same diagram that you had for your tariff. So we will still have, oh, that was awful. No. Okay, all right, let's try this again. Okay, so we're still going to have more or less the same diagram that we had for our tariff, but instead we're going to talk about our subsidy. And because we're talking about a subsidy, we're talking about an impact on the costs of production, which means that we're going to have an impact on, it's supposed to be a dollar sign, the supply curve. All right, so first off, let's draw, come on, Mr. David, draw a straight line. That's supposed to be a straight line. I'm going to draw the world price as per we did before. Now, let's assume that's a straight line. And if we do dots down here, all right, so you've got a quantity here. That is the quantity domestically supplied. And then if you do dots down here, that is quantity domestically demanded. So we know that that region there is the import. And what we're suggesting here is that we want to reduce the imports. We want it to be our farmers, whoever, our producers, our domestic producers, to earn more revenue, to have more employment, etc. So we're going to give them a subsidy. Now, what happens with subsidies is that we are reducing the cost of production. So it's the supply curve. So let's change the color. So essentially what we've done is, just as we would for micro, got a supply curve plus a subsidy. All right. Now we're not thinking about this equilibrium, okay, because we're not there, because this is our world price here. All right. So instead, we're going to look at this quantity here. And we're going to call that quantity supply dash. And what we've done is we've increased the domestic quantity supply by offering up that subsidy. By reducing the cost of production, we have greater domestic production. Right? We also have reduced imports. Now, again, you can play with this quite a bit, because I haven't said how you've worked out the subsidy. I haven't said how big the subsidy is, but in theory, you could add more subsidies and just keep subsidizing and subsidizing and subsidizing, and eventually just subsidize the imports right out the market. That is possible to do with a subsidy. Now, subsidy diagrams, when you look them up online, they can look a bit unusual. Some of them will, and I will do this, actually eliminate this part of the supply curve. And the reasoning being is because it doesn't exist. Nothing can be supplied down here, because this is the original supply curve, but this is the price that they're facing. So nothing is actually supplied down here. It's only when they get to this point, so effectively they've just, this is what the supply curve effectively looks like. Yeah, it's kind of bent, is basically what they've done. They have subsidized it from this point, because there really isn't any supply down here, okay, is what they're suggesting. So some books will have it like that. Other books or other sources online will have it as a straight line. You need to make sure you've got the labeling correct. It is a good idea to have arrows showing the shift. Okay. Obviously, the impact on imports is really important. In your discussion, again, you've got that same discussion. The point of this is to increase the domestic production. So that's what they're wanting to see. Now, some of you might be arguing this is an easier diagram than the tariff diagram. And, you know, I think the tariff one is a bit easier, to be perfectly honest. But that might just be me. Okay, now what I can do is I can stop sharing that. All right, we can go back to the nearpod, because now that you've seen how it is, my rough version of it. Oh, where'd it go? I don't need to do that. Come on. All right, my rough version of it. Now here you can see that I'm going to ask you just in the computer. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting it to be brilliant and perfect, but have a go, see if you can replicate more or less what I did, all right, in that Jamboard, illustrating the effect of a subsidy on a market for an internationally traded good. So key points to remember: supply and demand and the world price. Then the subsidy is going to shift that supply curve by the amount of the subsidy. All right, have a go. Let's see how you get on. You might be there, Sariha. Are you here, Sariha? Right, so having a go, trying to draw the effects of a subsidy on a market for an internationally traded good. Yeah, much easier to do this in class with scraps of paper and stuff that you would have. Good work, Fatima. Done. Good. Okay. A few more drawings coming in. Good work, good labeling. Very neatly done, Jensen. Okay, Joel. Good. Very good, Arena. In a minute, I'm going to tell you that I tend to make a mistake when I draw this diagram. And I'll tell you what that mistake is. And the reason why I make it is because that's how I got taught this particular model. And so I just do it. But it is a mistake, and it's one that, unfortunately, what we find is that some examiners can be quite picky. And they tend to be quite picky around labeling. So I'm going to show you the labeling and just have a wee conversation about the labeling and why examiners might get a bit picky with it. And what I don't understand, and I've never really understood this, is that examiners will get very picky about some labels but not others. Okay, and we've had this conversation a lot. Okay, when I marked, I used to get quite cross about the labeling, right, that I saw that was a problem, but wasn't actually mentioned in the mark schemes. And the chief markers would say, no, that's not a problem. But then another labeling that was wrong was a problem. So I'm trying to work out what the difference between the two is. So it depends very much on the year, right, that you have quite often. Right, still waiting on a couple of diagrams. Don't worry about the fact that you've got multiple people, multiple versions of you in there. All right, that's just the nexus way and you're the variant. No? Okay, I like that. Yeah. Okay. Now you just log in obviously more than once and it will create more than one of you. Good work. Make sure you are recognizing on the quantity axis the impact on the imports and the impact on domestic production. Work. Giraffe's got a good amount of color going on. Excellent. Good labeling. The other piece of advice that I will give you is, as I've probably said to you many times before, and no doubt will say again, is that you need to also, when it becomes a question in an exam, you need to then refer to what they're talking about in the exam. So if it's a subsidy for a particular good, you then need to refer to that good. If there are impacts on employees in the market for that particular good, then you must talk about those employees, yeah, those businesses, those employees, the effects on them. That's relating it back to the example that you've been given. Very good, Youngson. Good. I will talk about labeling in a minute. That's good. Yeah, I would have done the world price as a solid line. I know not every diagram will have that as a solid line, but I will do it as a solid line. And also just identifying that the impact on domestic production there, Fatima. You need to have it where the domestic supply intersects with the world supply. Right? So you've eliminated basically all of the imports, so it appears in your diagram, which is possible to do. Right? But you've got the point you're indicating is actually on the demand curve. So if you instead move it to being on the world supply and down to the axis, that will then tell you the true story, the true picture of where domestic supply will be at that price. Yeah, we're just needing to make sure that we highlight the impact on the quantity axis, because that essentially, that's the major, in fact, that's the main point of this. This protectionist policy is about trying to protect the domestic industries. So we need to get that bit absolutely right. Yeah, Joel, you're on the right path there. You haven't shown the actual level of imports, and that would then give you the change, because domestic production was down here, domestic production is now here, so you've got that move, but that's where imports are here. So you've decreased imports by that amount, but you're still getting imports. So you still should show the level of imports. Okay?
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Right. Just give you a few more seconds to work on that. Absolutely bang on, Sharaf. Well done. Yeah, okay. Your original supply curve isn't there, Joel. So we're probably going to need one.
Oh, I thought in the exam you don't draw the line because it's not there. I didn't know.
That's okay. Yeah, so you'll have a domestic supply curve, okay? And your domestic supply curve is going to give you the original quantity that domestic producers are producing. But when you add on the subsidy, their cost of production at every single price have decreased, so they're able to supply more quantities at every single price. So at this price, which was the world price, domestic producers are now able to produce this quantity here, which is a greater quantity. So they have increased their production by whatever that amount is. And again, in the exam, it might be an actual amount, right, that you can refer to. And by doing so, they have increased, well, production, but possibly employment, income for them, well, revenue for them, income for the workers, more aggregate demand through consumption spending, more tax revenue for the government, government's able to spend more. Yeah, that's sort of an argument. That's the analysis that you'd then be making. However, you are still getting this amount of imports here. You've just decreased the imports by this amount. So that is now your new imports. So do be careful with arrows, making sure that they match. I know mine didn't. Okay. So this is the amount of imports now, so you would then have a decreased amount of imports, and that might become a problem because it might be that you're importing raw materials for production, in which case now your raw materials then become more expensive. Okay? So hence your production processes then become even more expensive, and you might then need even more of a subsidy in the future because it's now more expensive because you're reducing that import. Yeah? So there could be all sorts of different things, right, that occur within this model and the analysis that comes from it. We're going to do a full analysis of a tariff. We may get to that today. I don't know that we will. Maybe in our next lesson. And I just want to go through the complete analysis with you so that you've got that nailed. Because one of the things that I'd like to do is I'd like to give you time, because you're allowed it, actual class time to work on your IA. And you might choose to work on your C3 during that time, or you might not have chosen your C3, so you might be just choosing your C3. and then you might want to do work on C1 and C2, you know, to tidy them up if that's what happens. But that will, we can do that, and that can be actual class time. We can't do it just yet because I'm wanting to make sure that you've got enough analysis down, okay, that you can do this. But that's what I will be looking at. I'll also be having a look through to see about the articles that some of you are picking, and just make sure that they are appropriate, and that they, well, appropriate in the sense that they're news articles. Right. Okay. Now, I'm going to move on. Okay.
Mr. David, sorry, I had one quick question about the graph.
Yes.
If where the world price intersects the supply and demand is where the country imports other goods, right?
Where the world price intersects supply.
Yeah, and then like to the where it is,
Yes.
those are the imports. So I would assume that the domestically produced goods would be like from 0 to
Yes.
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 Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you.
And again, it's about, you can get examples where there are actual numbers, right? And so you can be figuring out what this amount is, and then by how much it's changed. Okay, that is possible to do, particularly because you've now all got a quantity paper to do, a quantitative analysis paper to do, every single one of you. In the old syllabus, it was only the HL learners, but now it's all of you. So that is possible to work out the area here of imports, the new area of imports, how much has changed domestic production-wise. They could then give you a price, right? The cost, the actual price. So this is 2, but I don't know, whatever it is. So what is the actual amount? If they're selling 3,000, what is the revenue that they're gaining? So they were gaining this amount of revenue. They're now gaining this amount of revenue. How much is that? What is the percentage change on that? You see? That sort of approach could be asked for, or could be included just in your analysis. You've got an area here that's was it a rectangle, square, whatever that shape is. You can work that out as to how big that is. Then you can work out how big that rectangle is. You can work out the difference between the two. So you can actually show the change. All of that is entirely possible. Now, I did promise I would also talk to you about the labeling. Now, this is not the last time that I'm going to be expecting you to draw a subsidy diagram. Okay? It's definitely not the last time I'm going to be expecting you to draw a tariff diagram. So, yeah, unfortunately, we're just going to need to get used to it. Now, it is entirely possible, and here's where we get to some of those sort of weird twists of fate. It is entirely possible that you won't get a question about subsidies in your exam at all. Yeah? And I've had students in the past who've gotten cross with me because I teach the entire syllabus, and sometimes the examiners focus on certain parts. Well, of course they do. They can't test you on absolutely everything in the syllabus. They can't. So there will be chunks of work that you will either be able to incorporate into your answer, but it's not specifically asked for. Classic one is elasticity, right? There may be no, in microeconomics, there may be no actual question about elasticity, but they're still expecting you to include it in your answer, okay? And likewise, market failure, there can be, sometimes you need to include discussions about market failure, but it's not actually a market failure question. Yeah? So those sorts of approaches can come in. And the more we do macro, the more those sort of linkings between the topics occur. So you can include more and more, but they may not be a specific question on. Yeah? So just be aware of that. And there will be some who, oh, I learned all of this material and I didn't have to use it. And also remember, in the exam, you get to choose which questions to answer. So it might be that there is a subsidy question, but you choose the tariff question instead. Right? And that's absolutely fine. Okay? I have no problems with that at all. That's part of the skill of doing the exam. But My point is to try and give you as big a scope of skills as you can have, so that when you come across any question, you're able to answer it, by that, right, is the plan. So here we have the subsidy diagram. Now this is Welker Wikinomics, which feel free to look up online. He's got a huge range of resources. He's also got his own YouTube channel, which is very good as well. And I've put some of his videos as links into the different sites that you can also access. Now, the subsidy here, you'll see there is the analysis. Domestic production, what has happened to it? The supply has increased by the amount of the subsidy. We see the shift. And in this case, they're talking about a shift of $2,000. The world price is still below the domestic price, so consumers will still pay the price PW. This is a market for cars, I think. Yes, it is. Right? Because of the increased supply, domestic output increases from Q1 to Q2. And again, there could be actual numbers for those. Imports are decreasing from before they were Q1 to Q3, they're now Q2 to Q3. And again, there could be actual numbers for those. And you could be talking about revenues and all of that as well. Now, have a look at the labels. You might notice some things that every economist and pretty much every economics teacher labels these diagrams slightly differently. And I'm sorry about that. There is general conventions, but then there's also a lot of fluidity in amongst the labels. There is a reason why they've labeled this SD. Anybody know why they've labeled it SD?
Supply domestic?
Supply domestic, yeah. Now the problem with that is D is also the code for demand. So some people can get a bit confused with that, right? And whether it's fully understood that that is supply domestic and demand domestic, okay? And yes, by all means, use the labeling, but make sure you know what they mean. In the exam when I sat it, which I know was a long time ago, I actually wrote supply domestic and demand domestic. Right? And I've got terrible handwriting. Fatima knows this. Okay, I have appalling handwriting, and I was always losing marks for the examiner not being able to read what I'd written. Okay, so yes, something else to work on. You'll notice here that they've done supply domestic with the subsidy, but they've got this weird symbol here, W/subsidy. Right? That doesn't mean they're dividing it by the subsidy. That's just a short code word for with. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with that. If anybody has done, learned how to do shorthand notes, right? That's the shorthand note for with, W and then a line. Okay? It's not meaning that it's dividing it by, okay? Just so that you're not confused by that. I never used to do the shorthand note way. I always used to do supply plus, do a plus sign and then subsidy. And I'd actually write the word subsidy out. I wouldn't write sub, I'd write subsidy, because I was terrified that they wouldn't be able to read what I'd written, so I needed to give them as many clues as possible. And similarly, S plus S, unless you include a key, which you can do, explaining what the words all mean, that's possible. But if you don't say what the subsidy is in the diagram, then you might run into some problems. Okay. The other one is this. And this is the one I always used to get wrong, and I still do, okay? And it's because that's the way I was taught. So I'm trying to teach you out of that way, okay? PW is on this axis because this is the price axis. We shouldn't put PW here. Instead, we should put, as Fatima did, supply world, or SW, supply world, right? Because this then becomes the supply curve. Now that's the one that examiners do get picky on. Okay, and we had this conversation last year and the year before that. with teachers sending each other work and what do you think of this and what do you think of that, and it came down to this as to whether they got full marks for that question or not. And I think the question was about 6 marks. It was a calculation paper, and they ended up not getting full marks, and the reason why was because they put PW here and PW here, and the examiner didn't like that. Right, so practice will get you there, but please note that I do it wrong, okay, because of the way I was taught. Right? So attempt to teach you out of it is what I'm doing. Right, now, ladies and gentlebeans, right, just a thought before we finish for the day. We have 2 other protectionist policies that would be useful to understand. Okay, that would be useful to know how they are visually represented, or how they could be visually represented, what they mean, how they're visually represented, and then again the analysis, what the impact of that will be. So the first one is a quota. What was a quota again?
It's like a restriction to the quantity of a good or service.
Rockstar, absolutely right. The word quota contains that word quantity kind of within it. So that is where the government of the country says you can import, but you can only import this quantity of that good, whatever the good is. That's all you're allowed, okay? And embargo, what do you think that is? Do you remember that one?
When there's a restriction to like trade with a specific country or group of people, something like that, right?
Yeah, yes. But how big a restriction is it, Sharaf?
It can be both like temporary or like permanent, right? Something like that.
Yes.
I've read it in both. I won't, like something like that.
Yeah.
Does it have to be permanent?
It doesn't have to be permanent, no. But it does have to be complete. It is a complete ban. So now we're not saying you can import a quantity, we're saying you can't import any, not one. Right? It is called a partial embargo would then therefore be a quota. So I don't know that you could have a partial embargo. Right? You can have a complete embargo on a certain product. Or the other approach that, say, the United States has is a complete embargo on an entire country, not allowed to trade with that country at all. Say North Korea would be a classic example. Right? There are embargoes on the trade with North Korea. And in theory, if you break the embargo and secretly trade with them, it's a law, so you can get taken to court. Right? And whatever the punishment is, I really don't know. All right, there's a guy who's, anyway, I'll move on from there. So those ideas, quantities and embargoes are the next 2 protectionist policies that we are going to attempt to model. The embargo is quite straightforward because we're just banning the whole lot. You're not allowed to import anything. Sorry, done. A quota, because it's a quantity limit, will exist, but it's going to exist on the quantity axis. So it is going to be a physical restriction at whatever level the quantity is. Now, you would assume that they are wanting to reduce the quantity being imported, so it's going to have to be before the imports, yeah? Right, so we'll still have the world trade line, we'll still have, right, supply and demand, but the quantity line is going to be before that happens, because we're trying to reduce that quantity, improving domestic production, etc. That's the end result of what a quantity is going to do. There's a little bit more complicatedness with it, and part of the complicatedness of it isn't actually in your syllabus. Okay? So I will try and tread a fine line between showing you it and also not showing you it, if that makes sense. Okay? Now, there are a lot of economists who feel quite passionately that there should be protectionist policies. All right, there are a lot of politicians who feel there should be protectionist policies. These are models that we will then use to try and bolster our argument, whichever argument we're trying for. Right? In your analysis, you need to cover both. You need to cover the benefits and the costs. In your conclusion statements, you are going to need to have some sort of summarizing point that wraps it all up, that where you say they should not do this, they should do this because. Okay? That's what you are going to be expected to do. Now, team, your tasks for today are going to be reviewing the material, making sure you're able to diagram tariffs. You may have had a bit of a shock in your breakout group with regards to diagramming tariffs, making sure you can diagram now subsidies, and working through the analysis of both, working out what happens. If this tariff is put in place, what are the implications of it? If a subsidy is put in place, what are the implications of it? They're going to be very similar because they're both trying to achieve the same thing. The one that will be different is this quantity quota idea, and we'll have a look at that next time that we meet. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, hei kōnera, which means goodbye for now.
Bye, sir.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a rest.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank
you. All right. Stop recording. Stop recording.